10 days, 4 to 12 days. What we are very, in terms of the major symptoms, it's extremely common for a cough to continue for weeks after an influenza. It's extremely common for fatigue to continue for weeks after an influenza. One of the things that is also quite clear is that the way you address and treat the influenza not only has a huge impact on how you deal with it during the initial acute episode, but in terms of what happens to you over the longer term. Mismanagement of influenza can have a huge knock-on effect in terms of your long-term health. And we're not just talking about weeks or months, but considerably over the long term. So how we choose to treat influenza is a very key part of this story.
And I'll briefly put in there's a lot of evidence to suggest that things like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia are actually caused from poorly managed influenza. So people that don't actually stay in bed and do what they need to do to get better, and they're up and trying to go back to their normal lives a little bit.
Typically what we see is an onset of a fever initially. And typically the symptoms of that fever will tend to decline, typically after days 2 to 4. That's generally when people start to feel better. The whole body symptoms of influenza start to fall off. The muscle aches that, well, we'll get into the fever in a little bit. It's at that point, after that initial dip in fever, that many people are often tempted to return to work. That's often a decision that kills people. Evidence that we're looking at consistently shows that typically what produces the tendency for influenza to roll into pneumonia is getting out of bed too soon. Just at that point where the physiological response of the body moves past fever and into a different stage, that's the stage, typically around day 5 or 7, where we see the shift, in a sense, of the focus of illness towards the lower part of the respiratory tract. In the deaths that we're seeing in the current state of this pandemic, we typically see people running into problems between day 5 and 7. This fits directly over all our experience with previous influenzas and previous pandemics. At that juncture, we see either viral or bacterial pneumonia, or a combination thereof, generally growing up. And onset of symptoms at that juncture, we can see death within 24 to 48 hours. That's when things really come in fast. Typically, with influenza, what kills people is pneumonia, a shift to pneumonia. So a large part of our focus in terms of treatment is avoiding that shift in pneumonia, if at all possible. And there's a very great deal that we can do overly and otherwise to deal with that. Yes, you have a question?
Well, part of that might be you're lying in bed, you're not moving the fluids, they're starting to collect in your lungs. Is there anything you can do to combat that? Not for diuretics or
lymphatic massage, move the body around, getting somebody to do a certain kind of movement. Breathing, deep breathing is a huge one, and disinfecting the air, breathing that in.
The nature of the flu virus is that it basically moves in on the mid to upper part of the respiratory tract, the trachea, the throat. Although it affects the whole respiratory system, this is where the large part of the focus is. It's one of the reasons it's so transmissible. You might have heard a little about bird flu, or H5N1, the pathogenic avian flu, which is another flu that's lurking very much in the background right now. It's one that has a lot of people concerned for quite a long time. It tends to be very lethal, but it has a lot of difficulty being transmitted from its hosts, generally in domestic fowl, to human beings. One of the reasons it has difficulty being transmitted is that its receptor sites are much lower in the respiratory system. So it makes it difficult to be transmitted, whereas flu is much higher up. I mean, the H1N1 comes in much higher up. That's why it's much easier to catch it. And why the infection tends to be, for the most part, concentrated in this part of the system. It's also one of the reasons H5N1 tends to be more lethal. It gets down deep, right into the core early, and has a tendency to get into the lungs and then break through the epithelial lining into the system. I might just say that, as a very brief aside, there's a possibility that even though we're currently addressing the topic of H1N1, there's a very significant likelihood that in time we're going to be dealing with an H5N1 infection, or perhaps another mutation of the influenza virus. So even if this particular influenza proves relatively mild this time round, that doesn't mean that perhaps next year we might not be dealing with something far more serious. It could well be that we see a mutation as early as this year in terms of crossover, for example, between a highly transmissible and highly lethal influenza virus. At the moment we have highly transmissible and highly lethal, and that's sort of to one side. I see people, maybe, could we take a 5-minute break and get some air? See if you, yes, you're beginning to nod.
What time is it? What time
It's almost 5:30.
What time do we go? Well,
I think we go
6.
Dinner's at 6.
5:45.
okay, well we better press on.
Yeah.
All right.
We could open the door, open a window.
All right, just a few things then. Sonia pressed on this thing. If you have a suspected food allergy, don't deal with that suspicion whilst you're getting sick. Cut it out. Go back to dealing with that sort of issue later. Tobacco, smoking. All the evidence shows it's very problematic in terms of higher mortality, very much associated with smoking and influenza.
And I'll briefly say, if you all know, when you smoke tobacco, it freezes the cilia in your throat. And so those cilia that are responsible for getting all that crap out, all of a sudden can't move. And so for 24 hours after, so it's really important to cut out the smoking.
And one of the things I've consistently found through the years, sugar intake. Research clearly shows that taking sugar, even in small amounts, depresses the immune system within 30 minutes, up to 5 hours. Tiny little amounts. So if you can cut sugar intake, get sugar out of your diet, it'll make a huge difference.
Is that just like high glycemic sugars or all sugars?
All sugars. Well, I mean, I suspect, I don't know, but my sense is that in terms of my personal experience dealing with stuff, I use honey just fine. Sucrose, I suspect. Fructose, I suspect.
Honey's used to support the immune system.
Yeah.
But it's really high. It's sugary.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that, for example, we might, if we have time today, we'll get into the topic of elderberry syrups. I was in Fred Meyer's checking out their elderberry syrups. Most of the elderberry syrups that are sold through conventional sources are made with sugar. You don't want to be taking an elderberry syrup made with sugar if at all possible. Terra Firma, locally, great herb company, make one with a honey base, and Noman's company, Noman Carese's company makes one with a honey base.